Hello, we will now begin the graduate seminar for Week 8, focusing on the elementary rhetoric of the pastorals. Welcome to this week's seminar. Today we embark on a fascinating journey into the unique rhetorical landscape of the pastoral epistles, focusing on their introduction and basic academic background. We begin by examining the stylistic differences that set these letters apart from the rest of the Pauline corpus. There is no dispute among NT scholars that the pastoral epistles look and sound different in many ways than the earlier Pauline documents. This observation is foundational for our study. The letters to Timothy and Titus exhibit a distinct vocabulary, syntax, and rhetorical tone that have puzzled scholars for generations. However, we must ask a crucial question. What historically, not just linguistically, accounts for the similarity of style between these three epistles and their differences from the earlier Paulines? We cannot merely look at the words on the page. We must delve deeply into the historical context, the specific relationship between the author and the recipients, and the collaborative nature of ancient letter writing. As we explore the Lucan flavor of the pastorals, we will uncover how the specific rhetorical situations and the involvement of Paul's companions, particularly Luke, shaped the very fabric of these texts. It is essential to recognize that stylistic variations do not necessarily imply a different author, but rather a different rhetorical strategy tailored to a specific audience and purpose. In the case of the pastorals, the unique circumstances of their composition demand a nuanced approach to understanding their rhetorical character. We will see that the style is not a mere accident, but a deliberate choice driven by the need to persuade, encourage, and exhort church leaders in a transitional period of early Christianity. By recognizing these historical factors, we can better appreciate the sophisticated rhetorical artistry that underlies these seemingly simple letters and truly comprehend their enduring theological and pastoral significance. Moving forward, we must critically consider the specific audience and purpose of the pastoral epistles. The pastoral epistles are Paul's only truly personal and indeed private letters. They are not composed for oral delivery to a congregation. This is a monumental shift from letters like Romans or 1 Corinthians, which were specifically designed to be read aloud to entire communities of believers. Because Paul is writing to his trusted co-workers, Timothy and Titus, the rhetorical dynamics change significantly. Paul is engaging in encouragement and exhortation rather than offering up extended arguments and proofs. He does not need to persuade them from scratch because they already share his theological framework intimately. Therefore, these arguments however are brief and largely parienetic in character, and serve more as reminders rather than full-fledged attempts to convince, since Paul is preaching to the choir. Parienetic rhetoric is the rhetoric of moral exhortation, aimed directly at reinforcing accepted values rather than introducing new doctrines. Paul uses succinct rhetorical forms such as maxims, traditional materials, and short enthymemes to gently but firmly remind his delegates of their duties. He does not need to mount a massive forensic or deliberative defense of his gospel because Timothy and Titus are already fully on board. They simply need a pastoral nudge, a profound word of encouragement to stay the course and deal effectively with the rising challenges in their respective ministries. Understanding this private, parienetic nature is absolutely critical for our exegesis. If we read the pastorals expecting the sweeping theological arguments of Romans, we will inevitably be disappointed and we will severely misinterpret their rhetorical purpose. They are finely tuned instruments of exhortation, designed explicitly to galvanize the leadership of the early church. Let us now delve into one of the most compelling explanations for the unique style of the pastorals. In my view, we should prefer the conclusion that Luke was involved in all three documents. However, there are good historical reasons why. This collaborative view of authorship elegantly solves many of the linguistic and stylistic riddles that have plagued scholars for decades. As the text eloquently puts it, in the pastorals the voice is the voice of Paul, but the hands are the hands of Luke, who wrote these documents for Paul. We are not dealing with a later pseudepigrapher pretending to be Paul, but rather with a trusted companion, an educated physician and historian, who served as Paul's amanuensis or secretary. We are told plainly at 2 Tim 4:11 that Luke was with Paul at the time when he spoke the things now recorded in 2 Timothy. This historical anchor provides a solid basis for attributing the Hellenistic polish and specific vocabulary of the pastorals to Luke. In antiquity, a highly skilled secretary would not merely take dictation word for word, but would often shape the discourse, ensuring the Greek was elegant and rhetorically effective for the audience. Luke, whose own writings in the Gospel and Acts demonstrate a profound mastery of Greco-Roman rhetoric, was the absolute perfect candidate to draft these letters on Paul's behalf. He knew Paul's mind intimately, he shared his missional goals, and he possessed the literary acumen to craft these pastoral directives beautifully. By recognizing Luke's hands at work, we can fully appreciate the sophisticated, slightly more classical Greek style of the pastorals while maintaining their authentic Pauline authority and voice. To fully grasp the background of these letters, we must meticulously trace the historical movements of Paul and his companions. The "we" passages, which are found in Acts 16 verses 10 to 17 and in the latter part of the book, do refer to the author of the document accompanying Paul on part of his second and all of his third missionary journeys. These passages indicate that Luke was an active, eyewitness participant in Paul's travels, particularly around the Aegean Sea. It is highly plausible that Paul and Luke reconnoitered in Philippi, a city significantly dear to both of them. Here, Luke helped him to write these first two letters, then traveled with Paul eventually on to Rome, helping him with the final letter as well. This geographical and historical reconstruction seamlessly places the composition of 1 Timothy and Titus during a period of active travel and ministry, while 2 Timothy represents the final, poignant chapter of the apostle's life. Luke then composed 2 Timothy for Paul, based on Paul's last oral testimonies and instructions while under restricted house arrest. This means 2 Timothy was written under the dark shadow of Paul's impending martyrdom in Rome. Luke, acting as the incredibly faithful scribe, gathered Paul's final instructions, his deepest theological reflections, and his pastoral concerns into this masterful farewell discourse. Understanding this historical context breathes incredible life into the letters. They are not abstract theological treatises composed in a vacuum. They are urgent, highly practical communications forged in the very crucible of missionary journeys, imprisonments, and the pressing need to establish stable leadership. As we continue to meticulously establish the historical background, we must consider the intended destination of these letters, particularly 1 and 2 Timothy. One factor that is strongly in favor of 1 and 2 Timothy being written to a person or persons in Ephesus is that numerous of the persons mentioned in these two letters have a documented connection with Ephesus. When we look closely at the personal greetings and the specific individuals named, such as Timothy himself, Prisca, Aquila, Tychicus, Erastus, and Trophimus, we find a massive web of relationships centered tightly around the city of Ephesus. The personalia then favors the Ephesian destination for these documents. Ephesus was an incredibly major hub of early Christianity and a place where Paul had spent considerable, formative time during his third missionary journey. It was a city teeming with intellectual, commercial, and religious diversity, which also unfortunately meant it was a breeding ground for the false teachings that the pastorals so vigorously combat. By establishing Ephesus as the highly likely destination, we can far better understand the specific rhetorical exigencies Paul is urgently addressing. The false teachers were likely drawn directly from the sophisticated, perhaps Hellenized Jewish environment of Ephesus, requiring Timothy to be fully equipped with sound doctrine and authoritative instruction. The personalia, the list of names, is not just a closing formality. It is a vital piece of historical evidence that anchors these letters in a specific socio-rhetorical context. It reminds us that Paul is writing to real people, facing real challenges, in a very real and prominent city. Now we turn our attention to the very nature of ancient epistolography. What exactly was a letter in the Greco-Roman world? Letters, especially personal letters, were surrogates for an oral conversation face to face. In an era completely without modern telecommunications, the letter was the primary means of bridging physical distance, serving as a powerful substitute for the living voice. As Demetrius was later to stress, the function of a letter was not merely to continue a conversation and further a relationship but to reveal the author's true self. A beautifully well-crafted letter was expected to fully embody the character, the inner ethos, of the sender. When Timothy or Titus heard these letters read out loud, they were meant to feel the profound apostolic presence of Paul right there in the room with them. Cicero, expresses the same thing when he thanks Atticus for news which made him feel as though I was talking with you. This is precisely what Paul aims to perfectly achieve. The pastoral epistles are heavily saturated with Paul's pastoral concern, his unmatched apostolic authority, and his deep affection for his delegates. This fundamental concept of the letter as an oral surrogate is crucial to grasp. It means we should read the pastorals not merely as cold, static text, but as a vibrant, spoken discourse. The rhetorical devices beautifully employed are designed specifically for the ear, meant to persuade, to deeply comfort, and to command just as effectively as if Paul were standing right there. The authenticity of the letter was inextricably linked to how accurately it conveyed the true self of the author to the listener. Building effectively on the idea of the letter as an oral surrogate, we must critically examine the concept of Greek literary style. Luke Timothy Johnson astutely observes that Greek style itself in rhetoric and in letters was less a matter of personal expressiveness and more a matter of social presence and rhetorical craft. In the modern world, we all too often view style as a unique fingerprint, an unchangeable expression of an author's inner self. But in antiquity, a comprehensively trained rhetorician was expected to master various styles and deploy them strategically. Especially if one had some facility with language, one would adopt and adapt one's style to suit the occasion and the social context. A writer like Luke or Paul could easily write in a Semitic style when addressing Jewish themes, or elevate to a grand Hellenistic style when the solemn occasion demanded it. Therefore, with a writer having that degree of linguistic and rhetorical skill, one has to be careful what one concludes about authorship, and what was and was not within an author's scope, based on style. The fact that the pastorals sound noticeably different from Romans does not prove they are pseudonymous. It simply proves that the rhetorical situation was decidedly different. Writing private instructions to church leaders required a different stylistic register than writing a grand theological treatise to a church he had never visited. Recognizing the amazing flexibility of ancient rhetorical craft frees us from the rigid linguistic determinism that has often clouded the study of the pastoral epistles for many generations. Let us look closely at the very beginnings and endings of these letters, as they offer immense insight. Rhetorical modifications of standard openings and closings tell us something about the actual nature of the relationship and how such a letter further inscribes that relationship. In classical antiquity, the prescript of a letter was highly formalized, but Paul constantly tweaks these formulas to establish his ethos. The Pauline modifications of normal openings and closings in the pastoral have the rhetorical effect of characterizing the author as an authority figure, but one with humility. He is the servant of God. By introducing himself dynamically as an apostle of Christ Jesus, he asserts his absolute authority to direct the complex affairs of the church. Yet, by also calling himself a servant, he beautifully models the very humility he expects of his delegates. This delicate balance of power and piety is an absolute masterstroke of ethos construction. Timothy and Titus are clearly seen as under the tutelage of Paul. The rhetoric strongly reinforces their subordinate status, not to demean them in any way, but rather to fully authorize them. By publicly linking their ministry to his apostolic mandate, Paul provides Timothy and Titus with the necessary backing to firmly silence the false teachers and set the churches in proper order. Every single word in the opening lines is carefully chosen to powerfully negotiate the social and ecclesiastical hierarchy, reminding the recipients of who is speaking, by what specific authority, and for what divine purpose. As we move deeply into the body of the pastorals, we discover a remarkably sophisticated method of persuasion. Lewis Donaldson has brilliantly demonstrated that, behind all three of these letters is a coherent and consistent argumentative strategy. The pastorals are not just random collections of disconnected rules. They are highly structured acts of persuasion. Two rhetorical forms of persuasion are pursued throughout these three letters: 1. Enthymemes, and 2. Inductive and illustrative paradigms. Let's focus our attention closely on the enthymeme. Enthymemes, as Aristotle pointed out, are miniature syllogisms in which usually one of the elements or argumentative premises is omitted. Why omit a premise in a logical argument? Because stating the obvious is rhetorically ineffective and tedious. The idea here is that the briefer syllogism prompts the audience to fill in the gap, remembering what they have been taught before. When Paul writes to Timothy, he absolutely doesn't need to explain the foundational basics of the gospel. He uses an enthymeme to trigger Timothy's memory, forcing him to mentally complete the argument. This active cognitive participation makes the persuasion much more powerful. It is an intimate form of argumentation, relying heavily on the shared history and deep theological foundation between Paul and his delegates. By using enthymemes, Paul efficiently communicates highly complex ethical and theological directives, trusting that Timothy and Titus possess the requisite knowledge to connect the dots and vigorously apply the teachings to their specific pastoral contexts. Finally, we must appropriately contextualize the overall rhetorical level of the pastorals. Sometimes it is said about the rhetoric in the pastorals that it is of a more elementary sort than that found in the major Paulines. This observation is largely accurate, but it is certainly not a criticism. Rather, it is a profound recognition of genre. The rhetoric beautifully mirrors the foundational exercises of ancient education. The list of progymnasmata included the following composition exercises: fable, narrative, kriya, aphorism, confirmation or refutation, commonplace, eulogy or censure, comparison, prosopopia, thesis, and discussion of the law. We find many of these very elements, maxims, comparisons, and refutations, utilized extensively throughout the pastorals. Why? Because these letters inherently function as instructional manuals for pastors. The pedagogical character and flavor of the pastorals is undeniable, and it needs to be read in the context of Greco-Roman and Hellenized Jewish educational practices. Paul is acting brilliantly as the master teacher, effectively guiding his students through the necessary steps to govern the church well. He employs the progymnasmata because they are clear, memorable, and perfectly suited for moral instruction. He even warns vehemently against fables or myths, contrasting the pure apostolic teaching with the empty chatter of the false teachers. In essence, the pastorals are pastoral not just in content, but in their very rhetorical form, providing an incredible masterclass in leadership. The rhetorical framework of the pastoral epistles. The pastoral epistles represent Paul's only truly personal and private letters in the canonical corpus, distinct from his public congregational discourses. When we begin to analyze the pastoral epistles, we are immediately confronted with a text that feels profoundly different from the grand, sweeping arguments we find in Romans or the intense, problem-solving debates of 1 Corinthians. We are stepping into a distinctly different rhetorical arena. These documents, which include 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, are addressed not to a broad, diverse, and occasionally divided house church, but to individual, highly trusted apostolic delegates. Because the audience is singular and intimately familiar with Paul's foundational theology, the rhetorical strategy must fundamentally shift. Paul does not need to construct elaborate, foundational proofs from the ground up because he is writing to his own apprentices. The communication is high context. In the Greco-Roman world, private correspondence between educated peers often utilized a shorthand of shared philosophical and ethical frameworks. This is exactly what we witness here. The apostle is speaking to his lieutenants, and thus, the expansive deliberative and forensic speeches are set aside in favor of something much more direct and pragmatic. To fully grasp this, we must transport ourselves into the first-century Mediterranean world. Rhetoric was not merely a subject studied in school, it was the very lifeblood of public and private communication. When a senior figure wrote to a junior colleague, the expectations were clear. The senior figure would not waste expensive papyrus or precious time debating established facts. Instead, they would use targeted, authoritative language designed to produce immediate action. Paul is adopting this exact posture. He is writing as a seasoned general to his field commanders. The letters are infused with a sense of urgency and intimacy that precludes the need for the drawn-out, sophisticated proofs we see in his earlier epistles. The shift in style is not a shift in authorship, but a brilliant, calculated shift in rhetorical genre tailored perfectly to the pastoral crisis at hand. Consequently, they employ parienetic rhetoric aimed at encouragement and exhortation rather than extended, forensic, or deliberative proofs, utilizing rhetorical syllogisms, enthymemes, paradigms, and maxims. This is where the concept of elementary rhetoric comes into play. We must not confuse elementary with simplistic. In ancient rhetorical education, students learned through the progymnasmata, the foundational exercises that included crafting maxims, drawing comparisons, and building short, punchy arguments. Paul utilizes these very tools here with masterful precision. This is not because his theological acumen has diminished, as some critical scholars have erroneously suggested, but because the pastoral situation strictly demands perinesis, which is the rhetoric of moral exhortation, correction, and pastoral advice. He uses enthymemes, which are essentially syllogisms that deliberately leave one premise unstated. Why? Because the author and the recipient already share that understanding perfectly. Stating it would be redundant and rhetorically weak. He employs paradigms, pointing to his own life, his own sufferings, or the life of Christ as the ultimate, unarguable model for pastoral conduct. He uses maxims, which are short, memorable, universally applicable statements, to swiftly shut down the endless, speculative debates of the false teachers. This elementary rhetoric is ideally suited for co-workers who already share the apostles' theological foundation, requiring reminders rather than persuasion. This is a critical point for our seminar today, and it reshapes our entire hermeneutical approach to these texts. Paul is, in essence, preaching to the choir. He is writing to individuals who have traveled with him, suffered with him, and absorbed his complex theological teachings for years. Therefore, the primary goal of these letters is not to persuade Timothy or Titus of the inherent truth of the gospel, because they already believe it with all their hearts. The goal is to authorize them publicly, to galvanize their courage, and to provide them with the specific rhetorical and administrative tools they need to bring chaotic, misled congregations back into orthodox order. By using this streamlined, elementary rhetoric, Paul is actively modeling the very kind of clear, unambiguous, and authoritative teaching that he expects his delegates to deploy on the ground in Ephesus and Crete. He is equipping them with a rhetorical toolkit designed for immediate, practical application in the trenches of early church ministry. They do not need a theological treatise, they need a field manual. And that is exactly what the elementary rhetoric of the pastorals provides, a sharp, focused, and deeply persuasive manual for safeguarding the nascent Christian movement. Furthermore, the use of maxims and enthymemes serves a dual purpose. It not only communicates efficiently with Timothy and Titus, but it also provides them with easily memorizable and transmittable units of truth that they can, in turn, use to instruct their congregations. In an oral culture, where texts were scarce and expensive, memorable maxims were incredibly valuable. Paul is essentially giving his delegates the rhetorical ammunition they need to fight the theological battles in Ephesus and Crete. He is arming them with sound bites of orthodoxy that can cut through the complex, confusing, and ultimately empty rhetoric of the false teachers. This is the brilliance of the elementary rhetoric found in the pastoral epistles. It is perfectly adapted to its environment, maximizing impact while minimizing unnecessary debate, ensuring that the core message of the gospel remains untainted and actively shapes the life of the early church. Enthymemes and rhetorical syllogisms in 1 Timothy. In 1 Timothy, Paul heavily relies on enthymemes, which are truncated syllogisms where a premise is unstated because it is culturally or theologically assumed by the recipient. To fully appreciate the rhetorical genius of 1 Timothy, we must delve deeply into the concept of the enthymeme. In classical Aristotelian rhetoric, a full syllogism is a complete logical argument consisting of a major premise, a minor premise, and a necessary conclusion. An enthymeme, however, deliberately omits one of these premises. It does this because the speaker knows the audience already shares that specific knowledge. It relies on the audience to mentally fill in the blank, making the argument highly participatory and exceptionally efficient. It is the absolute hallmark of high-context communication in antiquity. When Paul writes to Timothy, his beloved child in the faith, he does not need to laboriously prove the basic tenets of the Christian gospel. He simply invokes them to authorize Timothy's decisive actions against his opponents. This rhetorical shorthand allows Paul to be incredibly forceful and rapid in his argumentation. The situation in Ephesus was becoming increasingly dire. False teachers were spreading confusing doctrines based on myths and endless genealogies, actively disrupting the unity and the moral fabric of the house churches. Paul uses this rapid-fire, enthymematic rhetoric to cut straight through the noise. By employing these truncated arguments, Paul effectively communicates that the truth is already established and what is required now is swift action without hesitation. He rapidly contrasts the sound, healthy doctrine of the true gospel with the sickly, speculative, and ultimately useless nature of the opponent's teachings. The goal here is not to engage the false teachers in a prolonged deliberative debate, which would only lend them unwarranted legitimacy, but rather to dismiss them authoritatively. The rhetorical force of an enthymeme lies in its unspoken assumptions. When Paul says the law is not laid down for the innocent but for the lawless, he leaves unstated the premise that the false teachers are acting lawlessly. Timothy makes the connection instantly. This creates a tight, impenetrable bond between the sender and the receiver, locking out the dissenting voices who do not share the same foundational premises. The use of traditional materials, such as early Christian hymns and faithful sayings, functions as inartificial proofs that carry inherent authority, bypassing the need for complex logical deduction. In the Greco-Roman rhetorical handbooks, such as those meticulously compiled by Quintilian, proofs were strictly categorized into two types, which are artificial and inartificial. Artificial proofs were those invented by the speaker's own logic, creativity, and persuasive skill. Inartificial proofs were those existing entirely outside the speaker's invention, such as ancient laws, binding contracts, or sworn witness testimonies. For Paul and the pastorals, the faithful sayings and the fragments of early Christian hymns serve as his undeniable inartificial proofs. When he writes that the saying is sure and worthy of full acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, he is not creating a new theological argument from scratch. He is citing a universally accepted, bedrock truth within the early Christian community. He uses these established, sacred traditions as hard, indisputable evidence to bolster Timothy's pastoral position and to completely silence the opposition. This is elementary rhetoric operating at its most powerful and effective level. It leverages the massive weight of shared, sacred tradition to establish unassailable authority. By quoting hymns that the Ephesian congregations likely sang during their worship gatherings, Paul is brilliantly turning their own liturgy into a weapon against heresy. He is reminding them of what they already confess to be true when they gather together. This bypasses the need for complex, drawn-out logical deduction. If the community already sings it, they must believe it, and therefore, they must reject any teaching that contradicts it. This shows that Paul's rhetorical strategy is perfectly calibrated for the crisis at hand, using the very life and worship of the church as his primary means of persuasion. It is an incredibly sophisticated use of elementary forms, demonstrating that Paul remained a master persuader even when writing private, administrative correspondence. The function of maxims and traditional codes in Titus. The epistle to Titus exemplifies the use of maxims and household codes to establish communal order, utilizing concise, authoritative statements to shape the ethical contours of the Cretan Christian community. When we turn our attention to the epistle to Titus, we encounter a masterclass in the rhetorical use of maxims and established social codes. A maxim, in the context of ancient rhetoric, is a short, pithy statement expressing a general truth or rule of conduct. In the progymnasmata, the foundational exercises of Greek rhetorical education, students were trained extensively in how to deploy and expand upon maxims. Paul utilizes this elementary rhetorical form to brilliant effect on the island of Crete. The situation Titus faced was notoriously difficult. The Cretan culture was stereotypically viewed in the ancient world as unruly, deceptive, and morally lax. To combat this deeply ingrained cultural inertia, Paul does not write a lengthy philosophical treatise on ethics. Instead, he fires off concise, highly authoritative statements. These maxims act as ethical anchors. They are memorable, they are portable, and they are indisputable within the context of apostolic authority. By providing Titus with these sharp, condensed ethical directives, Paul is giving him the exact tools necessary to bring order to the chaotic house churches scattered across the island. The use of maxims was particularly effective in oral cultures, where learning and reinforcement happen primarily through hearing and repeating memorable phrases. Paul instructs Titus to speak these things, to exhort, and to reprove with all authority. The brevity of the maxim is its power. It leaves no room for the endless debating and linguistic hair-splitting that the false teachers preferred. It draws a stark, unmissable line between acceptable Christian behavior and the surrounding pagan culture. By deploying the Epimenides paradox, a cultural maxim, Paul rhetorically shames the opposition while establishing a localized ethos for Titus, further using household codes as deliberative ethical paradigms. One of the most fascinating rhetorical moves in all of Paul's letters occurs in the first chapter of Titus. Paul quotes a famous Cretan poet and philosopher, Epimenides, who notoriously stated that Cretans are always liars, vicious brutes, and lazy gluttons. This is a brilliant rhetorical maneuver. By using a cultural maxim from one of their own revered figures, Paul effectively silences his opponents using their own cultural heritage against them. He rhetorically shames the false teachers by aligning their deceptive behavior with the worst stereotypes of their own society. This immediately establishes a strong, localized ethos for Titus. It shows that the apostolic mission is not ignorant of the local culture, but rather deeply aware of it and ready to confront its darkest aspects. Following this sharp cultural critique, Paul introduces the household codes, known in German scholarship as the Hostafellen. These codes were common in Greco-Roman philosophical and political discourse, used to describe the proper functioning of a household, which was seen as the foundational building block of the state. Paul adapts these codes for a specific deliberative and apologetic purpose. In a hostile pagan environment that viewed this new Christian sect with deep suspicion, the behavior of the believers had to be above reproach. The household codes serve as ethical paradigms that instruct the community on how to live respectably and harmoniously. By advising older men, older women, young men, and slaves on how to conduct themselves with dignity, self-control, and submission, Paul is executing a brilliant apologetic strategy. He is ensuring that the Word of God is not discredited by the scandalous behavior of its adherents. The rhetoric here is intensely pragmatic. It is about survival, respectability, and the quiet, powerful witness of a transformed life in the midst of a watching, skeptical world. The household codes are not just arbitrary rules, they are carefully calibrated rhetorical tools designed to protect the vulnerable Christian community from external persecution and internal collapse, proving once again the profound efficacy of Paul's elementary rhetoric. Syncresis, rhetorical comparison in pastoral leadership. A prominent rhetorical strategy in the pastorals is syncresis, or rhetorical comparison, where Paul consistently juxtaposes the approved character of the apostolic delegate with the deceptive nature of the false teachers. As we continue our deep dive into the elementary rhetoric of the pastoral epistles, we must thoroughly examine the technique known as syncresis. In the Greco-Roman educational system, syncresis was a highly valued rhetorical exercise that involved setting two subjects side by side to evaluate their relative worth. We see this masterfully executed in literature by figures like Plutarch in his Parallel Lives. Paul utilizes this precise comparative strategy to navigate the leadership crises in Ephesus and Crete. The fundamental issue at stake was one of authority and authenticity. Who should the congregations listen to? The apostolic delegates like Timothy and Titus, or the charismatic but deceptive false teachers who were dividing the house churches? To resolve this, Paul does not merely list the theological errors of the opponents, he attacks their character. He consistently juxtaposes the approved, tested, and selfless character of his delegates with the chaotic, avaricious, and fundamentally deceptive nature of the false teachers. By setting these two portraits side by side, Paul makes the choice abundantly clear for anyone listening. He describes the opponents as morbidly craving controversy, obsessed with disputes about words, and treating godliness as a means of financial gain. In stark contrast, he commands Timothy to pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness. This is not just moral advice, it is a highly calculated rhetorical maneuver designed to completely dismantle the credibility of the opposition while simultaneously elevating the status of the true minister. The audience is forced to look at the two contrasting models of leadership and make a definitive moral choice. This binary opposition is designed to solidify the ethos of the true leader, placing the virtues required of overseers and deacons in sharp relief against the vices of the opponents. The use of syncresis directly serves to establish and solidify ethos, which is the perceived character and credibility of the speaker or leader. In ancient rhetoric, a speaker's ethos was often considered the most powerful element of persuasion. If the audience did not trust the character of the speaker, the logical arguments would fall on deaf ears. Therefore, the extensive lists of qualifications for overseers and deacons found in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1 must be read through this rhetorical lens. These are not just bureaucratic checklists for church administration, they are vibrant portraits of virtuous leadership painted in direct opposition to the vices of the false teachers. When Paul states that an overseer must be above reproach, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, and an able teacher, he is implicitly reminding the congregation that the false teachers possess none of these qualities. The false teachers are insubordinate, empty talkers, and deceivers whose minds and consciences are corrupted. By utilizing the rhetoric of praise and blame, which is the hallmark of epideictic oratory, Paul guides the community's allegiance. He praises the virtues that build up the community and aggressively blames the vices that tear it apart. This sharp relief makes the abstract concepts of good and evil tangible and easily recognizable in the daily life of the church. Furthermore, this rhetorical strategy of comparison serves a vital protective function. By clearly defining what virtuous leadership looks like, Paul is immunizing the congregations against future charlatans. He is providing them with a reliable ethical template by which they can measure anyone who claims to speak for God. The syncresis does not just solve the immediate crisis, it establishes a permanent boundary line for Orthodox Christian leadership, demonstrating how elementary rhetorical forms can have profound, long-lasting theological and ecclesiological impacts. Inartificial proofs and sacred texts in 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy, often considered Paul's final testament, elevates the use of inartificial proofs, primarily through the invocation of the Hebrew Scriptures and reminders of childhood education in the sacred texts. When we transition from 1 Timothy and Titus to 2 Timothy, we encounter a palpable shift in tone and rhetorical strategy. 2 Timothy is widely regarded as Paul's farewell discourse, his final testament before his impending execution in Rome. In ancient literature, the testamentary genre carried immense emotional and authoritative weight. The dying words of a patriarch or a great leader were to be received with absolute reverence. In this highly charged context, Paul elevates his use of inartificial proofs to their absolute zenith. As we discussed earlier, inartificial proofs are those pieces of evidence that exist outside the speaker's own logical invention. They are the undeniable facts, the sworn testimonies, the unchangeable laws. For Paul, the ultimate inartificial proof is the body of sacred Hebrew Scriptures. He appeals directly to Timothy's personal history and his childhood education. He reminds Timothy of the sincere faith that lived first in his grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice, and he reminds him of how from childhood he has known the sacred writings. This is a profound rhetorical move. Paul is anchoring Timothy's present courage not merely in Paul's own apostolic authority, which is soon to be extinguished by the executioner's sword, but in the ancient, unshakable bedrock of the Scriptures and his own family heritage. By doing this, Paul is ensuring that the foundation of Timothy's ministry will survive long after Paul is gone. He is transferring the weight of authority from his own living voice to the eternal, written Word of God. This prevents the encroaching apostasy from sweeping Timothy away, because his anchor is tied to something far more permanent than any single human leader. The rhetoric shifts toward a solemn, forensic defense of the Pauline gospel, where the divine inspiration of Scripture is the rhetorical bedrock for teaching, reproof, and training against encroaching apostasy. The rhetorical atmosphere of 2 Timothy is distinctly forensic. It feels like a defense speech delivered in the shadow of a Roman tribunal. Paul knows that his time is running out, and he knows that the false teachers are growing bolder, acting like gangrene spreading through the body of the church. In this intense, almost defensive posture, Paul drops one of the most significant theological and rhetorical anchors in the entire New Testament. He declares that all Scripture is God-breathed, or theopneustos, and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness. This declaration is not merely a statement of systematic theology, it is the ultimate rhetorical trump card. By defining the Scriptures as the very breath of God, Paul establishes them as the absolute, unquestionable standard for all Christian doctrine and practice. If the Scripture is God-breathed, then any teaching that contradicts it is entirely invalid. This provides Timothy with an infallible weapon against the false teachers. He does not need to out-debate them using clever sophistic philosophy, he simply needs to hold up the inartificial proof of the inspired text. The Scriptures become the ultimate witness, the final judge and jury in the court of theological opinion. This rhetorical bedrock is absolutely essential for the survival of the Church in the post-apostolic age. Paul is preparing Timothy to stand alone, armed only with the sacred texts and the memory of his mentor's faithful suffering. By shifting the ultimate authority to the inspired Scriptures, Paul ensures that the gospel message remains perfectly intact, fully capable of reproving error, correcting falsehood, and training the next generation of believers in righteousness. It is a masterful, deeply moving use of elementary rhetoric to secure the future of the Christian. Movement in its darkest hour. The ethos of the suffering apostle. The ethos of Paul himself becomes a central persuasive element, particularly in 2 Timothy, where he employs the rhetoric of the noble sufferer by emphasizing his chains and impending martyrdom. In the study of classical rhetoric, the concept of ethos is absolutely paramount. Ethos refers to the perceived character, credibility, and moral authority of the speaker. Aristotle argued that ethos is perhaps the most potent form of persuasion, because if an audience does not fundamentally trust the speaker, they will immediately reject even the most logically sound arguments. In the pastoral epistles, and most vividly in 2 Timothy, Paul's own ethos takes center stage. He does not rely merely on his academic pedigree or his past accomplishments, rather, he leans heavily into the rhetoric of the noble sufferer. He repeatedly draws attention to his physical chains, his profound isolation, and his impending, violent death at the hands of the Roman state. He mentions that all in Asia have turned away from him, and he vividly describes himself as already being poured out as a drink offering, with the time of his departure securely at hand. To a modern ear, this might sound like a desperate plea for sympathy, but in the context of first-century Greco-Roman culture, it was something entirely different. It was a well-established and highly respected rhetorical motif. Think of Socrates drinking the hemlock, or the Stoic philosophers who endured tremendous physical hardship to prove the superiority of the mind over the body. Suffering for a noble cause was considered the ultimate validation of one's philosophy. By embracing his chains and facing death with unshakable confidence, Paul is employing this powerful cultural trope to completely validate his apostolic message. His suffering proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that he is not a charlatan seeking financial gain, unlike the false teachers he so fiercely condemns. His willingness to lose his life for the gospel is the absolute, undeniable proof of its truth. This is not a plea for pity, but a powerful rhetorical paradigm where Paul's suffering validates his message and serves as a model of endurance for Timothy. The rhetorical brilliance of this approach lies in its function as a paradigm, or a model, for imitation. Paul is not displaying his wounds to garner pity, he is displaying them as battle scars to inspire bravery. He explicitly tells Timothy to join with him in suffering for the gospel, relying on the power of God. By presenting himself as the ultimate example of faithful endurance, Paul creates a compelling rhetorical imperative for his young delegate. If the great apostle is willing to endure the horrors of a Roman dungeon for the sake of Christ, then Timothy must certainly be willing to face down the relatively minor discomfort of confronting false teachers in Ephesus. Paul's ethos of suffering effectively shames any inclination toward cowardice. When Paul writes, "I am suffering even to the point of being chained like a criminal, but the word of God is not chained," he is delivering a rhetorical masterstroke. He contrasts his own physical confinement with the absolute, unstoppable freedom of the gospel message. This provides Timothy with immense psychological and spiritual leverage. The paradigm of the noble sufferer completely redefines the concept of victory and defeat. In the eyes of the Roman Empire, Paul is a defeated criminal. But in the rhetorical framework of the epistle, Paul is a triumphant conqueror who has fought the good fight, finished the race, and kept the faith. By inviting Timothy to step into this very same paradigm, Paul is securing the future leadership of the church. He is ensuring that the next generation of pastors will not be deterred by persecution or hardship, because they have been provided with the ultimate model of how to suffer nobly and victoriously for the sake of the eternal gospel. The strategy of indirection and direct exhortation. The pastorals masterfully blend direct exhortation with indirection, as the letters were undoubtedly intended to be overheard by the congregations, creating a dual rhetorical audience. One of the most fascinating and sophisticated rhetorical dynamics in the pastoral epistles is the delicate interplay between direct address and purposeful indirection. On the surface, these letters are highly personal documents. They are directly addressed from Paul to his specific, named delegates, Timothy and Titus. They contain personal instructions, travel plans, and intimate greetings. However, we must absolutely recognize the communal context in which these letters were received and read. In the first-century church, letters from the apostle were not read silently in a private study, they were read aloud in the gathered assembly of the house churches. Paul knew this perfectly well. Therefore, when he wrote to Timothy and Titus, he was fully aware that the entire congregation, including the faithful members, the undecided observers, and the hostile false teachers, would be listening intently. This creates what rhetoricians call a dual audience. Paul is speaking directly to his delegates, but he is simultaneously broadcasting a message to the overhearing congregation. This technique of indirection is a brilliant administrative and rhetorical strategy. Instead of directly confronting the rebellious congregation, which might only entrench their stubbornness and escalate the conflict, Paul addresses the congregation indirectly by explicitly instructing their leader. When Paul tells Timothy how people ought to behave in the household of God, the congregation overhears exactly what the apostle expects of them. They receive the apostolic rebuke and instruction, but without the confrontational sting of being directly attacked. This saves face for the congregation while clearly establishing the boundaries of orthodox behavior. By instructing the delegates on how to manage the church, Paul indirectly addresses the church members themselves, effectively isolating the false teachers and fortifying the appointed leaders. This strategy of indirection serves a vital function in solidifying the hierarchy and authority structure of the local church. By publicly instructing Timothy and Titus on how to appoint elders, how to manage widows, and how to silence opponents, Paul is visibly investing them with his own apostolic authority in front of the entire community. When the congregation overhears Paul giving these massive administrative responsibilities to his delegates, it leaves absolutely no room for doubt about who is truly in charge. The false teachers, who were likely trying to undermine Timothy and Titus, are completely outmaneuvered. The overheard letter effectively isolates them. Paul does not debate the false teachers, he simply instructs his delegates to command certain people not to teach different doctrines. By talking about the opponents rather than to them, Paul strips them of their legitimacy and refuses to grant them the dignity of a direct apostolic debate. Furthermore, this overhead rhetoric fortifies the appointed leaders. It provides them with a public mandate. Timothy does not have to claim authority for himself, he simply has to execute the written orders of the great apostle, which the entire church has just heard read aloud. It is a masterful display of administrative wisdom through elementary rhetoric. It achieves compliance, establishes order, and neutralizes opposition, all through the sophisticated use of an overheard conversation. This demonstrates that Paul was not only a profound theologian but also an exceptionally shrewd manager of human dynamics, using every rhetorical tool at his disposal to guide and protect the fragile communities of the early Christian movement. Pathos and the emotional appeal of the imprisoned mentor. While the pastorals are highly instructional, they are deeply infused with pathos, as Paul appeals to the deep emotional bonds forged through shared ministry to motivate his delegates. In our exploration of ancient rhetoric, we have discussed logos, the appeal to logic, and ethos, the appeal to character. We must now turn our full attention to pathos, the appeal to profound emotion. It is a common misconception to view the pastoral epistles merely as dry, administrative church manuals, devoid of feeling. Nothing could be further from the truth. These letters, particularly 2 Timothy, are absolutely saturated with deep, poignant pathos. Paul is writing as an old man, facing execution, to his younger protégés whom he loves dearly. He deliberately utilizes this intensely emotional reality as a powerful rhetorical lever. In classical rhetoric, as taught by Aristotle and Quintilian, arousing the emotions of the audience was considered essential for moving them to decisive action. Pure logic might convince the mind, but it is emotion that moves the hands and the feet. Paul appeals directly to the deep familial bonds forged through years of shared, dangerous ministry. He calls Timothy his beloved child. He recalls Timothy's tears, likely shed at their last parting, and expresses a deep, aching longing to see him again so that he may be filled with joy. This is not merely sentimental fluff, it is a highly calculated and appropriate use of rhetorical pathos. By invoking these intimate, shared memories, Paul is binding Timothy to himself with ties of absolute loyalty and profound affection. He is making it psychologically and emotionally impossible for Timothy to abandon his post or betray the gospel they both suffered for. The emotional weight of the dying mentor's request makes obedience not just a matter of duty, but a matter of profound love and honor. This emotional appeal is a classic rhetorical technique to secure loyalty and action, using shared history and tears to ignite courage and combat the spirit of cowardice. The specific goal of this intense pathos is to combat fear. Timothy was facing a terrifying situation in Ephesus. The false teachers were aggressive, the Roman authorities were increasingly hostile, and his great mentor was chained in a dungeon facing certain death. It would be entirely natural for a young leader to experience cowardice in the face of such overwhelming opposition. Paul uses pathos as the specific antidote to this paralyzing fear. He reminds Timothy of his spiritual heritage, invoking the memory of his grandmother and mother, effectively saying, "Your family history demands bravery." Then, Paul delivers the crucial emotional and theological pivot. He declares that God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, but rather a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline. By framing courage as a divine gift and cowardice as a spiritual failure, Paul uses emotional leverage to ignite bravery. He wraps his commands in the warm embrace of relational love. When Paul says, "Do not be ashamed of the testimony about our Lord or of me his prisoner," the emotional pressure is immense. To be ashamed of the gospel would be to be ashamed of Paul himself, the spiritual father who is bleeding out for that very message. The rhetoric of pathos here is designed to produce an unbreakable resolve. It bypasses the fear of the mind by appealing to the fierce loyalty of the heart. By utilizing tears, shared suffering, and familial love, Paul ensures that his delegate will stand firm in the darkest of times, proving that emotional appeals, when grounded in genuine relationship and theological truth, are among the most powerful rhetorical tools available to any leader. The rhetoric of sound doctrine. A unique rhetorical feature of the pastorals is the medical metaphor of sound doctrine, contrasting the healthy, life-giving teaching of the gospel with the diseased, gangrenous nature of heresy. As we analyze the specific vocabulary and rhetorical tropes of the pastoral epistles, one striking feature stands out prominently above the rest. It is the pervasive use of medical and physiological terminology to describe theological concepts. The most famous example of this is the recurring phrase sound doctrine, which in the original Greek is hygienousa didaskalia. The root of this word gives us the English word hygiene. Paul is literally talking about hygienic, healthy, and life-giving teaching. This is a brilliant rhetorical innovation. In the ancient world, health and disease were matters of immediate, daily life and death. There were no antibiotics, and infections were terrifyingly lethal. By utilizing this medical metaphor, Paul is attaching visceral, somatic weight to abstract theological debates. He contrasts the healthy, robust nature of the true apostolic gospel with the diseased, morbid nature of the false teachings. He describes the opponents as having a morbid craving for controversy. Even more graphically, he warns that their teaching will spread like gangrene, explicitly naming Hymenaeus and Philetus as carriers of this deadly theological infection. This is not just colorful language, it is a highly aggressive and persuasive rhetorical strategy. By framing the debate in terms of public health, Paul instantly alters the congregation's perception of the false teachers. They are no longer seen merely as eccentric philosophers with alternative viewpoints, they are rhetorically defined as carriers of a deadly plague that threatens the survival of the entire community. This somatic rhetoric powerfully shapes the audience's perception, equating orthodoxy with physical and spiritual health, and defining the leader rhetorically as a healing physician. The power of a metaphor lies in its ability to completely reframe a situation and dictate the appropriate response. If false teaching is merely an alternative opinion, then tolerance and debate might be the appropriate responses. But if false teaching is a gangrenous infection, then the only appropriate response is immediate, radical, and absolute excision. You do not debate gangrene, you amputate it to save the body. By employing this medical rhetoric, Paul provides Timothy and Titus with the absolute justification they need to take severe disciplinary action against the heretics. Furthermore, this metaphor brilliantly defines the role of the pastoral leader. The apostolic delegate is no longer just a teacher or an administrator, he is rhetorically positioned as the physician of the soul. His job is to administer the healing balm of sound doctrine and to protect the flock from spiritual contagion. This drastically elevates the vital importance of orthodox teaching. It is not about intellectual conformity, it is about spiritual survival and vitality. When Paul tells Titus to rebuke them sharply, so that they may become sound in the faith, he is describing a harsh but necessary medical intervention. The sharp rebuke is the surgeon's scalpel, designed to cut away the diseased tissue so that true health can be restored. This rhetoric of health and disease resonates deeply with human psychology. It bypasses complex theological wrangling and appeals directly to the basic human desire for life, wholeness, and safety. It proves once again that Paul's elementary rhetoric in the pastorals is highly sophisticated, using vivid, culturally resonant metaphors to protect the theological integrity and the spiritual vitality of the early Christian churches. Conclusion: the efficacy of elementary rhetoric. The elementary rhetoric of the pastoral epistles proves to be a highly sophisticated and efficacious mode of communication for early Christian leadership, providing a timeless blueprint for pastoral administration. As we draw this seminar to a close, it is crucial that we summarize and synthesize our findings regarding the rhetorical landscape of the pastoral epistles. For entirely too long, critical scholarship has looked at 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus and concluded that because they lack the sprawling, complex, deliberative arguments of Romans or Galatians, they must therefore be rhetorically deficient, perhaps even the work of a lesser, later imitator. I hope that our deep dive today has thoroughly dismantled that misconception. What we actually see in these letters is not a degradation of rhetorical skill, but rather a brilliant, masterfully targeted adaptation to a new set of circumstances. Paul is no longer writing to persuade a divided congregation of the basic tenets of the faith. He is writing private, highly urgent correspondence to his fully trained, trusted apostolic delegates who are stationed in the middle of severe crisis zones in Ephesus and Crete. In this specific context, long-winded philosophical proofs would not only be unnecessary, they would be rhetorically inept and practically useless. Instead, Paul deploys elementary rhetoric, utilizing the foundational, punchy, and highly authoritative forms of communication taught in the ancient progymnasmata. This is the rhetoric of command, of rapid response, and of administrative stabilization. It provides a timeless blueprint for pastoral administration, demonstrating how to communicate truth with maximum efficiency and unyielding authority. The strategic use of enthymemes, maxims, synkresis, and the profound integration of ethos and pathos demonstrate that the pastorals are rhetorically adapted to their specific, private, and highly urgent context. Let us briefly review the specific tools in this rhetorical toolkit. We saw how Paul utilized enthymemes, the truncated syllogisms that rely on the shared high-context knowledge between the apostle and his delegates, allowing for rapid-fire argumentation. We examined his use of cultural maxims and household codes in Titus, deploying compact, memorable ethical directives to bring immediate order to the chaotic Cretan culture. We explored the power of synkresis, the sharp rhetorical comparisons that juxtapose the virtuous character of the true leader against the greedy, deceptive vices of the false teachers, thereby forcing the audience to make a clear moral choice. We witnessed the overwhelming power of inartificial proofs in 2 Timothy, where Paul anchored the future of the church not in his own fading life, but in the eternal, God-breathed nature of the sacred scriptures. We saw how he leveraged his own ethos as the noble sufferer, turning his prison chains into the ultimate validation of his apostolic message. And finally, we explored how he seamlessly wove deep, emotional pathos and the vivid medical metaphors of sound doctrine to ignite courage and demand absolute theological hygiene. Far from being simplistic, the elementary rhetoric of the pastoral epistles represents a pinnacle of pragmatic, situational communication. It is the perfect rhetorical vehicle for its intended purpose, which was to equip the next generation of leaders with the exact conceptual and linguistic weapons they needed to defend the gospel, silence the opposition, and secure the future of the Christian movement in a hostile world. Understanding this rhetorical strategy unlocks the true power, urgency, and enduring relevance of the pastoral epistles for the Church today. Welcome everyone to the 8th week of our advanced seminar on New Testament rhetoric. Today, we are focusing on the final section, the conclusion and application of the elementary rhetoric found in the pastoral epistles. As we transition into this crucial topic, we will explore the pragmatic shift in Pauline rhetoric. We begin by reflecting on the assertion that the conclusion of our investigation into the pastoral epistles reveals a pragmatic and intentional shift in Pauline rhetoric, moving from the macro-rhetorical masterpieces of Romans and Corinthians to a more elementary, functional discourse. What this means for our broader understanding of the Apostle Paul is quite profound. For weeks, we have analyzed the complex arguments found in his public letters, witnessing a rhetorician at the absolute height of his persuasive powers, deploying sophisticated forensic and deliberative strategies to unite divided churches. However, when we turn our analytical gaze to the pastoral epistles, we encounter a strikingly different rhetorical landscape. It is essential to recognize that this transition to a more fundamental, elementary rhetoric is a deliberate and masterful recalibration of his communicative strategy, designed specifically to meet the immediate, practical, and pressing needs of his closest co-workers in the mission field. Moving to our next key point, we must understand that this shift is not indicative of a degradation in rhetorical aptitude nor a definitive proof of pseudepigraphy. Rather, it exemplifies the rhetorical principle of accommodating the message to the specific audience, in this case, trusted apostolic delegates. This observation strikes at the very heart of the historical debate surrounding the authorship of the pastorals. Often, modern critical scholars have pointed to the simpler linguistic style and the reliance on basic rhetorical forms as undeniable evidence that the historical Paul could not possibly have penned these letters. Yet, such a viewpoint fundamentally misunderstands ancient Greco-Roman rhetorical theory, which heavily emphasized the concept of audience adaptation, or decorum. When a seasoned orator is writing to a familiar, subordinate colleague, the elaborate exordiums and lengthy probatios necessary to persuade a divided congregation are entirely superfluous. Paul is engaging with insiders who share his deepest theological convictions. Therefore, the apparent simplicity of the text is actually a profound testament to Paul's rhetorical mastery, demonstrating his ability to tailor his discourse perfectly to the pastoral context. Our final consideration on this matter is that the rhetoric of the pastorals functions fundamentally as an applied pastoral strategy, utilizing basic forms to establish church order and defend against doctrinal deviation. This practical application is the ultimate goal of the elementary rhetoric we see deployed here. Paul's primary concern is not to construct a soaring theological treatise, but to equip his delegates with the necessary tools to govern the nascent church effectively. By employing straightforward paraenesis, easily memorable maxims, and concise enthymemes, he provides instructions that are not only clear but readily transmissible. These tools serve a vital dual purpose: they instruct the leaders themselves, and simultaneously, they provide those same leaders with a pedagogical framework to instruct their local congregations. In an environment threatened by false teachings, the clarity of elementary rhetoric serves as the most effective mechanism for preserving the orthodox integrity of the Christian community. Thus, the pastoral epistles stand as a brilliant example of applied rhetoric in the vital service of pastoral care. Continuing our deep dive into the conclusion and application of the pastoral epistles, we must now examine the distinctive level of rhetoric at play, specifically contrasting elementary versus advanced discourse. It is a critical observation that the pastoral epistles operate on a fundamentally different rhetorical plane compared to the major Pauline epistles, characterized by the deployment of basic, foundational exercises rather than complex macro-rhetorical structures. When we read letters like Romans or the Corinthian correspondence, we are navigating through a dense forest of sophisticated rhetorical strategies. We encounter prolonged diatribes, intricate refutations of anticipated counterarguments, and masterful uses of insinuatio to introduce controversial topics. These are the hallmarks of a rhetorician operating at the highest levels of advanced discourse, engaging audiences that require rigorous, multifaceted persuasion. However, the letters to Timothy and Titus strip away this complexity. They present us with a streamlined, unadorned style of communication. This is not a deficiency, but a strategic choice. The rhetoric here is functional, designed not to impress with oratorical fireworks, but to provide stable, easily comprehensible guidance for church administration. It represents a vital shift from the public arena to the private instructional setting. This brings us to the realization that this elementary nature is evidenced by the conspicuous absence of prolonged argumentation, elaborate digressions, and the intricate forensic or deliberative proofs that define texts such as Romans or 1 Corinthians. In those major epistles, Paul often has to lay a massive theological foundation before he can even begin to issue ethical or practical commands. He must establish his ethos, narrate the history of salvation, and carefully dismantle opposing viewpoints. In the pastorals, this lengthy preparatory work is entirely bypassed. Paul does not need to convince Timothy that the gospel is true, nor does he need to defend his apostolic authority to Titus, who is already his loyal emissary. Because the foundational relationship and shared beliefs are already securely in place, the extensive proofs that occupy chapters upon chapters in Romans are simply unnecessary. The absence of these complex structures is a direct reflection of the specific, intimate nature of the correspondence. Instead of laboring over lengthy theological justifications, Paul can immediately address the pressing issues at hand. Consequently, we observe that instead, the discourse relies heavily on straightforward syllogisms, concise paradigms, and direct ethical injunctions, reflecting an educational methodology rooted in the earliest stages of formal rhetorical training. The rhetorical tools Paul selects for these letters are akin to the fundamental exercises taught in the Greco-Roman schools of rhetoric. He utilizes brief, logical deductions, or enthymemes, to quickly establish a point without needing to map out every premise. He employs clear paradigms, holding up specific individuals as models of behavior to be imitated or avoided. He relies on maxims and traditional sayings, quoting early Christian hymns and trustworthy statements that serve as undeniable axioms of faith. These are the building blocks of communication, the elementary forms that are highly effective for instruction and memory retention. By leaning on these direct ethical injunctions, Paul is providing Timothy and Titus with a practical handbook for ministry. These concise, authoritative commands are precisely what a young leader needs when facing a rebellious faction within the church. The elementary rhetoric of the pastorals, therefore, is an intentional, highly effective pedagogical strategy. Moving forward, we must address one of the most contentious issues in New Testament scholarship, dispelling the myth of rhetorical decline and the authorship debate. It is a striking reality that the implementation of elementary rhetorical forms in the pastoral epistles has frequently been misinterpreted by historical critical scholars as an indication of declining apostolic cognitive ability or as definitive evidence of pseudepigraphical origins. For over a century, a significant branch of biblical scholarship, largely originating from the 19th-century German academic traditions, has looked at the vocabulary, the sentence structure, and the rhetorical style of the pastorals and concluded that they must be later creations. The argument often posits that the vibrant, complex, and sometimes convoluted thinker who wrote Galatians could not possibly be the same author who penned the stark, imperative-heavy instructions of 1 Timothy. They assume that if Paul is the author, he must always sound exactly like the author of his most famous public treatises. However, this assumption is inherently flawed. It treats Paul not as a versatile, living communicator, but as a one-dimensional literary figure incapable of altering his register. This leads us directly to the profound flaw in such critical approaches. This interpretation fails to account for the sophisticated classical principle of decorum, wherein the orator masterfully adjusts the complexity of the discourse to precisely match the intellectual capacity and the relational proximity of the recipient. The concept of decorum, or appropriateness, was absolutely central to ancient Greco-Roman rhetorical theory, championed by figures like Cicero and Quintilian. A master rhetorician would consider it highly inappropriate, and indeed artificial, to use the same rhetorical tools for a private letter to a close friend as they would for a public defense before a hostile tribunal. The relational proximity between Paul and his delegates, Timothy and Titus, demands a completely different rhetorical register. A private letter to a beloved child in the faith requires warmth, directness, and foundational instruction, not soaring philosophical dialectic. To use a sledgehammer to drive a small nail is the mark of an amateur, not a master. By recognizing the intentionality behind this stylistic adaptation, we vindicate the rhetorical integrity of the letters, understanding them as a pragmatic deployment of pedagogical tools by a seasoned apostle addressing his most trusted lieutenants. This realization fundamentally shifts our understanding of the text's origins. It shows Paul as an incredibly versatile communicator. Contrast his approach before the Areopagus in Athens, where he quotes Greek poets, or his defense before the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, with his approach here in the pastorals. The pedagogical tools he uses here are perfectly suited to the monumental task of passing the baton of leadership to the next generation. The survival of the Pauline mission depended entirely on these lieutenants understanding and executing clear, unambiguous instructions. The unadorned style is exactly what the historical situation demanded. Therefore, rather than viewing the elementary style as a sign of pseudepigraphy or old age, we must recognize it as the brilliant, calculated choice of a seasoned leader ensuring the longevity and stability of his life's work through effective, targeted communication. This leads us to our next critical slide, which focuses on audience-centric rhetoric and specifically, addressing apostolic delegates. In classical rhetorical theory, the recipient of the message dictates the form of the message itself. A fundamental tenet of ancient persuasive speech is the rigorous analysis of the audience, a principle that profoundly shapes the pastoral epistles, as they are uniquely addressed to individual apostolic delegates rather than diverse congregational bodies. Consider Aristotle's three pillars of rhetoric: the speaker, the subject, and the audience. The audience determines the trajectory of the entire discourse. When Paul writes to the Corinthians, he is addressing a divided, chaotic, and diverse group of Jews and Gentiles, rich and poor, mature and immature believers. The strategy there must be broad and deeply persuasive. However, when writing to Timothy or Titus, the audience is singular, highly dedicated, and extensively trained. They have accompanied Paul on his missionary journeys and understand his mind perfectly. Because of this unique dynamic, the rhetorical strategy undergoes a massive transformation. We must recognize that because Paul is communicating with ecclesiastical insiders, who possess an intimate knowledge of his theological framework, the necessity for foundational argumentation is eliminated, allowing for a highly concentrated focus on immediate pastoral administration. This is the essence of insider communication. Paul and his delegates share the exact same linguistic codes and theological shorthand. Paul does not need to explain the profound mysteries of why the gospel is true, he only needs to remind them to guard that truth fiercely. This shared understanding drastically reduces the need for the probatio, which is the extensive proof section of a classical speech. Instead of laying groundwork, Paul can immediately start building the house. He moves straight into discussing how to handle unruly widows, how to appoint qualified elders, and how to discipline insubordinate members. The rhetoric becomes highly efficient. This efficiency leads to our third major observation: this audience-centric approach transforms the letters into authoritative manuals for ministry, strategically designed to empower the delegates with the rhetorical and organizational tools necessary to combat localized crises in Ephesus and Crete. The pastorals are not abstract philosophical musings, they function as early church manuals, what later traditions might call a Kirchenordnung. The specific crises facing these young leaders are severe. There are mythologies, endless genealogies, creeping asceticism, and outright rebellion spreading within the house churches. Timothy and Titus, as young and potentially vulnerable leaders, need clear, unassailable apostolic backing to assert their own authority in these volatile situations. These letters provide that exact backing. By writing in a clear, authoritative, and directive tone, Paul is essentially handing them a sword and a shield. He gives them the precise words to say and the exact organizational structures to implement, ensuring that the apostolic mission continues unabated despite the surrounding chaos. Let us now delve into the specific mechanics of this elementary style with our fifth topic, the utilization of progymnasmata in pastoral instruction. To truly understand the pastorals, we must understand the educational world in which they were written. The rhetorical structure of the pastoral epistles is deeply indebted to the progymnasmata, the standardized preliminary exercises that formed the core curriculum of Greco-Roman rhetorical education in the 1st century. The progymnasmata were the rigorous drills that young students mastered long before they ever attempted to compose a full, multi-layered public speech. Ancient educators like Theon, Hermogenes, and Aphthonius designed these exercises, which included the crafting of fables, short narratives, refutations, and maxims. Paul, having been educated in cosmopolitan environments like Tarsus and Jerusalem, would have been intimately familiar with these foundational techniques. Rather than abandoning them as he matured, he strategically redeploys them here. We observe that Paul effectively utilizes these foundational exercises, such as the composition of crii, maxims, and brief moral paradigms, to deliver concentrated, memorable units of instruction suitable for emerging church leaders. A perfect example is his use of the cria, which is a brief, useful anecdote or saying attributed to a specific person. Paul repeatedly uses the formula, trustworthy is the saying or faithful is the word, throughout the pastorals. These function as undeniable maxims. They are sharp, concise, and carry immense moral weight without needing lengthy justification. When he provides a list of qualifications for an overseer, he is utilizing a descriptive paradigm, a basic rhetorical tool designed to paint a clear picture of virtuous character. These are not sprawling theological arguments, they are tight, concentrated bursts of truth. This brings us to the ultimate purpose of this technique. This reliance on the progymnasmata demonstrates a brilliant pedagogical strategy, ensuring that the apostolic directives are not only comprehended by the delegates but are also easily transmissible to the wider congregation. We must remember the primary pastoral directive given to Timothy, to teach others who will be qualified to teach others also. You cannot easily or accurately transmit a dense, 16-chapter argument like the epistle to the Romans orally across multiple generations of largely uneducated believers. The risk of theological distortion is simply too high. However, you can perfectly transmit a clear, pithy maxim. You can easily memorize and pass on a short, structured list of virtues required for leadership. By utilizing the progymnasmata, Paul is designing a theology that is portable. He is giving Timothy and Titus the exact pedagogical tools they need to instruct their own flocks. The elementary rhetoric, therefore, is not just for the benefit of the delegates reading the letter, but for the entire community that will eventually hear these truths spoken aloud in their house churches. Moving to slide 6, we encounter the dominant mode of discourse in these letters, paraenesis, the rhetoric of reminder and ethical exhortation. If we wish to categorize the specific type of speech Paul is employing, we must look to this ancient form. A defining characteristic of the elementary rhetoric within the pastorals is the pervasive use of paraenesis, a specific form of moral exhortation designed not to introduce novel concepts, but to reinforce previously established behavioral and theological norms. Paraenesis is unique because it is intentionally unoriginal. It does not seek to break new theological ground or present revolutionary ideas. Instead, it relies heavily on traditional teaching, utilizing a highly imperative tone, and is almost always based on a foundation of friendship or a deep father-son relationship, much like what Paul shares with Timothy and Titus. The core message of paraenesis is simply this: keep doing what you already know is right. It is about remembering and holding fast. This stands in sharp distinction to other forms of rhetoric we have studied. In contrast to the rigorous logical proofs of deliberative oratory that seek to alter future congregational decisions, paraenetic discourse relies on the established authority of the mentor to encourage perseverance and moral steadfastness. When Paul writes to the Corinthians, he is using deliberative rhetoric to argue for unity in the future, trying to persuade factions to change their course of action. He has to prove his points logically. Paraenesis, however, doesn't argue, it commands and reminds. Because the mentor, in this case the Apostle Paul, possesses unquestioned ethos and authority in the eyes of his pupil, he does not need to justify his moral demands. He can simply state them as facts. He exhorts Timothy to fight the good fight and to guard the deposit. These are not points up for debate, they are solemn charges. Finally, we must look at the macro-level effect of this strategy. By saturating the epistles with paraenetic reminders, Paul provides an enduring ethical scaffolding that protects the nascent Christian communities from the corrosive influences of surrounding pagan culture and internal moral decay. The pastorals are famous for their detailed household codes and their explicit lists of virtues and vices. This is paraenesis in its most practical action. This ethical scaffolding is absolutely vital. It builds a protective wall against the moral laxity of Crete, where the culture is described as consisting of liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons, and against the aggressive syncretism and myth-making of Ephesus. The young churches are vulnerable, existing as tiny islands of orthodox belief in a vast ocean of paganism. The paraenetic reminders serve as the structural steel of the community, ensuring that the believers know exactly how they ought to conduct themselves in the household of God, which is the pillar and bulwark of the truth. Our seventh slide explores the fascinating sociological and rhetorical dynamics of insider communication and shared epistemological foundations. To read the pastorals correctly, we must recognize the intimacy of the connection between the author and the audience. The pastoral epistles represent a paradigm of insider communication, wherein the reader and the recipient operate upon a vast, unstated foundation of shared theological convictions, historical experiences, and ecclesiastical goals. In modern sociological terms, this is the difference between high-context and low-context communication. When you speak to a stranger, you must provide a vast amount of background information, a low-context situation. But when you speak to your spouse or your best friend, a single word or a brief phrase can convey paragraphs of meaning, because the context is already deeply shared. Paul and Timothy have traveled the Mediterranean world together for years. They have faced persecution together. They possess a completely shared vocabulary and a unified worldview. Because of this, the way they communicate is highly efficient. This shared epistemological foundation permits the use of theological shorthand and highly condensed references to the gospel narrative, bypassing the need for the exhaustive theological justifications found in Paul's public epistles. This is why we see such dense, compact theological statements in the pastorals. When Paul tells Timothy to remember Jesus Christ, raised from the dead, descended from David, he is utilizing a profound theological shorthand. He does not have to spend 3 chapters explaining the mechanics of the Davidic covenant or constructing a logical proof for the resurrection of the dead, as he was forced to do in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. The foundation is already rock solid between them. A simple reminder acts as a hyperlink to their shared vast theological understanding. The practical result of this high-context communication is immensely significant for the structure of the letters. Consequently, the rhetorical energy of the text is fully redirected from foundational persuasion toward practical implementation, ensuring that the delegates can swiftly execute apostolic policy without ambiguity or theoretical distraction. Because Paul does not have to spend 8 chapters meticulously explaining the doctrine of justification by faith, as he does in Romans, he can spend 3 full chapters explaining precisely how to organize the widows, how to vet potential elders, and how to instruct slaves and masters. The rhetoric is completely unshackled from the burden of proof, allowing it to become highly efficient and intensely pragmatic. It is pure, unadulterated policy execution. Paul is giving his generals the marching orders they need to organize the troops on the front lines of the mission field, without wasting a single breath on unnecessary theoretical debate. This intense focus on practical application leads us directly to slide 8, the function of basic rhetorical forms in church order. We must ground our rhetorical analysis in the messy, historical reality of the early church. Within the turbulent social and theological environments of the first-century Mediterranean world, the deployment of basic rhetorical forms served as a crucial stabilizing mechanism for the establishment and maintenance of rigid church order. The first-century house churches were often places of profound social mixing, rapid numerical growth, and unfortunately, charismatic chaos. The shifting social boundaries between Jews and Gentiles, slaves and free, men and women, created incredible tension. To survive this internal friction and external persecution, the nascent church desperately needed institutionalization. It needed structure. Basic, elementary rhetoric provided the concrete, unyielding language required for this stabilization. It provided the necessary blueprint for survival. We can see this blueprint in the specific literary forms Paul chooses to employ. By utilizing unembellished virtue and vice lists, explicit household codes, and categorical qualifications for overseers, the pastorals construct an unambiguous institutional boundary that demarcates orthodox Christian behavior from societal deviance. Take, for example, the lists of qualifications for elders and deacons found in 1 Timothy and Titus. These are not complex, philosophical arguments about the nature of leadership, they are rigorous checklists. They draw sharp, definitive boundaries. You must be the husband of one wife, sober, hospitable, and not a lover of money. This absolute clarity is essential. It prevents ambitious, charismatic, but morally unqualified individuals from seizing power within the power vacuum of the early house churches. The lists provide an objective standard that transcends subjective opinion or charismatic appeal. Ultimately, these forms take on a legal and authoritative character. These elementary rhetorical structures function essentially as ecclesiastical law, providing the apostolic delegates with undeniable, codified authority to regulate community life and suppress anarchic elements within the congregations. When a dispute arises in Ephesus, Timothy does not need to reinvent the theological wheel. He can point directly to the physical letter and say, "This is the apostolic standard. This is the law of the church." It brilliantly removes the burden of proof from the shoulders of the young, perhaps timid delegate, and places it squarely on the written, apostolic word of Paul. The rhetoric itself becomes the ultimate authority, a codified manual that empowers the delegate to act decisively, suppress rebellion, and maintain the holy order required for the church to function as the household of the living God. Our ninth slide shifts our focus to the highly polemical nature of these texts, defending the faith, rhetorical tools against false teaching. While we have discussed the administrative function of these letters, we must also recognize their combative purpose. The elementary rhetoric of the pastoral epistles is not merely administrative, it is fiercely polemical, utilizing precise, authoritative injunctions as primary weapons in the urgent battle against encroaching false teachers and theological subversion. The threat facing Timothy and Titus was absolutely real and incredibly dangerous. Individuals like Hymenaeus and Philetus were actively shipwrecking the faith of some, teaching destructive doctrines such as the claim that the resurrection had already taken place. In this environment, rhetoric could not just be a tool for organization, it had to be a weapon for defense. However, the way Paul chooses to fight this battle is rhetorically fascinating. Rather than engaging the opponents in prolonged dialectical debate or sophisticated refutation, the epistles employ the rhetorical strategy of categorical condemnation, labeling the opposing doctrines as diseased, demonic, and inherently corrosive. When you read Romans or Galatians, you see Paul using the diatribe, engaging with imaginary interlocutors, anticipating their arguments, and logically dismantling them piece by piece. He gives the opposing view a platform in order to crush it logically. In the pastorals, he completely abandons this approach. He absolutely refuses to debate the false teachers. He does not grant their myths and endless genealogies the dignity of a logical refutation. Instead, he uses visceral, medical metaphors. He describes their teaching as a gangrene, a spreading disease, a demonic deception. He uses the rhetoric of categorical condemnation. This is a highly specific and intentional rhetorical choice designed to delegitimize the opponent instantly and entirely in the eyes of the congregation. The goal is not to win an argument, but to protect the flock. This aggressive, non-discursive approach serves to inoculate the Christian community, establishing an impenetrable rhetorical quarantine around the Orthodox tradition and empowering leaders to swiftly excommunicate persistent heretics. By using such harsh, definitive language, Paul builds a massive firewall around the church. He issues rapid, severe commands. He tells Titus to warn a divisive person once, then a second time, and after that, to have absolutely nothing to do with them. It is an aggressive, uncompromising strategy of containment. This strategy is heavily reliant on the unquestioned ethos of the apostle and the delegated authority of his lieutenants. The elementary rhetoric of the pastorals, therefore, acts as a swift, surgical instrument, cutting away the diseased flesh of false teaching to preserve the life and health of the spiritual body. Finally, we arrive at our 10th slide, offering a final synthesis, the enduring efficacy of pastoral rhetoric. As we conclude this seminar, we must bring together the various threads of our investigation to appreciate the full magnitude of Paul's achievement in these letters. In final synthesis, the elementary rhetoric of the pastoral epistles must be recognized not as a literary deficiency, but as a masterpiece of applied, context-specific communication that successfully secured the survival of the post-apostolic church. For too long, scholarship has dismissed the pastorals as non-Pauline simply because they lack the soaring stylistic flourishes of his earlier work. But as we have seen, this view is woefully inadequate. When viewed through the proper lens of ancient rhetorical theory, these letters emerge as brilliant, tactical examples of context-specific rhetoric. They provided exactly what was needed to bridge the perilous gap between the foundational apostolic era and the institutionalized early Catholic Church. The transition required clear, undeniable directives, and Paul delivered them flawlessly. By expertly adjusting his stylistic register to accommodate the intimate relational dynamic with his delegates and the urgent administrative needs of the congregations, Paul demonstrates the ultimate flexibility and power of ancient persuasive arts. Paul proves himself to be a true chameleon of communication. He is a master orator precisely because he knows when to change his voice. He can soar with the philosophical eagles in Romans chapter 8, he can sing with the poetic angels in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and, as we see here in the pastorals, he can lay down the law with the crisp, uncompromising precision of a military commander. This incredible flexibility, this perfect application of decorum, is the true mark of a master rhetorician. He does not serve his style serves his mission. And the success of that mission brings us to our final point. The enduring legacy of these epistles lies in their profound pragmatic efficacy, providing a timeless, rhetorically robust paradigm for pastoral leadership, ecclesiastical organization, and the unwavering defense of orthodox Christian truth. The reason we still study these texts, the reason they remain the absolute foundational documents for church polity across the globe today, is because their rhetoric works. The elementary rhetoric, the clear, unambiguous commands, the easily memorable maxims, the unyielding ethical standards, and the sharp boundaries drawn against heresy, continues to shape and protect pastoral ministry 2,000 years later. The ultimate genius of the pastoral epistles is not found in complex philosophical speculation, but in their staggering pragmatic efficacy, ensuring that the household of God remains the pillar and foundation of the truth for all generations.